Since 1976, I had known there was a Richard Alfred Horner born 100 years before me, but I knew almost nothing else about him. As I began serious research, I learned that he is a file cutter. When I finally download the full census report of 1880, I'm startled to see the name of the folks living next door to Richard. It is the family of John F. Horner, and he is also a file cutter. Whoa, what is this? And soon I'm looking at a listing in the Columbus, Ohio City Directory published in 1864, 16 years before that. There, in alphabetical order, are John F. Horner and Richard A. Horner, both file cutters. If at that point there is any doubt they are brothers, the point is settled in the Racine City Directory of 1882. In bold print is the listing for the Horner brothers, file makers, at 520 Villa Street. Before early 2012, I had never known or ever heard about John Forrest Horner. We've learned a good bit about John in this narrative. His obituary, mentioned earlier, paints a snapshot of his life. What we learn from the next few census tells us a lot about the young widow that survives him. I surmise that she is one of the strongest characters in this whole story. She has herself and 4 of her children to provide for. Her only resource, beside what I assume was a minimal amount of cash, is the mortgage farm. At least 2, and probably nearer 6 years after John's death, she is still on the farm. In the 1910 census, she has 4 of her children with her on the mortgage farm that John bought when they left the file cutter business in Racine 20 years before. She says she had 5 children with John, and all survive. 1 has moved away. Remember, this woman was born in a foreign country, has lived only in urban areas. Now she must wrest a living for herself and her brood from an inhospitable, unfamiliar farm environment. And I know how tough the farming business is. I also know that the country that John chose is an especially tough place to farm. Frost-free season is short. The soils are generally poor in that area. I can imagine they raise corn, oats, and hay, tend a large garden. I think there would be some chickens, some pigs, and a small herd of dairy cattle. I know it is a hard life. As we say, eking out a living. In 1910, she tells the census taker that she, at 52 years, is the farmer, and sons, 32-year-old Richard and 18-year-old Irving, are laborers. None of the 4 kids at home is married. Ellen D., known as Nellie, is retarded. Eventually becomes a patient at the Wisconsin Home for the Feeble-Minded. Upon her death in 1922, she is buried alongside her father in St. Peter's Cemetery at Shennington, Wisconsin. The other children go their own ways during the next few years. Apparently about 1915 or so, the farm is sold, and in 1920, Martha is married to a nearby widower and farmer by the name of Merritt T. Strait. Strait, who joined the Minnesota militia at 17, is a Civil War veteran. Our hat is off to Martha Ann Hammond Horner Strait. We hope she found happiness in her new home. Merritt predeceases her and at her death on Christmas Eve 1924, she is living in Roscoe, Illinois, with son Edmund. When I learned of John Forrest Horner, I wondered if there was any connection between his lineage and the George Horners of my youth, or the mudjacking Horners of late years living in Racine. I followed up as much as possible with his children, and this is what I learned. First child, Susanna, married Fred Gunther, became the mother of a prominent and prosperous family. She, perhaps, of all the people in our story, becomes the first to achieve financial security, if not affluence. Second child, John Jr., basket maker, stays on in Racine, marries Pauline, and fathers George, whose telephone listing I observed in my growing up years. None of my family seem to know that George is a relative of ours. For some reason, none seem interested in following the life of John Forrest Horner, brother of Richard Alfred. Probably the reason is they never heard of him. George does not have any sons, so I believe there are no more Horners in Racine from that line. We have talked about John's Alfred before. He was first a file cutter, then joined his brother Richard and cousin R. Alfred making baskets. He married briefly, then relocated to Tacoma. He spent the rest of his life in common, if not menial, labor. Apparently, John's Alfred fathered no offspring. These first three children of John were from his first marriage to Mary Wainwright, sister of Richard's wife, Harriet. These three were all born in Yorkshire before their migration to Ohio. For the next 17 or 18 years, John has no more children. After Mary's death in 1874 and his wedding to Martha Hammond in 1876, 5 more offspring follow, well spaced over 19 years. All were born in Wisconsin, the first 3 in Racine, the last 2 on the Hardscrabble farm near Shennington. The first is named Richard. This John's Richard becomes a basket maker but follows his father and mother Martha to the farm in Juneau County. He is still there in 1910 after the death of his father, helping his mother on the farm at the age of 32. After the sale of the farm by his widowed mother, the only record we can find of him is in the 1917 World War I draft registration. He is in Los Angeles at the time. Martha's second child is Edmund Forrest. Born in Racine, he too goes with the family to the Cutler Township farm, but soon moves to Roscoe in Winnebago County, Illinois. There he marries 16-year-old Dora, and they have a son, Horace, before they are divorced. Edmund works first as a farmer, then painter, paper hanger, and odd job laborers. In Roscoe, he takes in his twice widowed mother, Martha, before her death in 1924. In 1884, the same year, my grandfather Howard is born to Alfred and Emma. A daughter joins the family of his granduncle John and Martha. They name her Ellen. Her brothers reverse the letters of her name and call her Nellie. Nellie also joins the family move to Shennington and is still with her mother on the farm after her father's death in 1908. When the farm is sold about 1915, I suspect mentally challenged Ellen is sent to the Wisconsin Home for the Feeble-Minded. She is about 30 years old at the time. Interestingly, in the census of 1920, at that home, they note she is able to read and write. 2 years after that census, Ellen, also known as Nellie, dies at the age of 38. She is buried in St. Peter's Churchyard in Shennington, alongside her father. The next child is named Irving. He is with Mom Martha in 1910, but in 1920 he is in Bend, Oregon, living with a woman named Clara Horner, who has two daughters, also named Horner. He is listed as her brother-in-law. If this is all true, the only explanation I have is that Brother Richard, who we lost track of for a number of years, but turns up in Los Angeles in 1917, has spent time in Oregon, married Clara, and left her with 2 children. Apparently they divorce, and Brother Irving moves in with her, or maybe, and probably, he was already boarding with them. In 1930, Irving marries Clara, and they add sons Kenneth and Robert. Irving is first a teamster at a lumber mill, later becomes a plumber. By 1940, Irving and Clara are divorced, and the sons live with her in tiny Ty in western Oregon. Irving is living as a boarder in Bend, several hundred miles away, still working as a plumber. The final child is son Walter, born in 1895, while the family is at Shennington. Dad, John Forrest, is 64 years old at his birth and will die when Walter is 13. After the farm is sold, Walter joins his brothers in Oregon for a time, but by 1930 he is back in Wisconsin, this time in Kenosha. His older cousin, our Alfred, lives there, but Walter, they have never met him, so we don't know exactly why he chooses Kenosha. While there, he marries a widow named Harriet Milkey, who has 2 daughters by her first marriage. They have no other children. He works for Nash Motors. Shirley Mooney, who has lived in both Racine and Kenosha, sometimes downstairs from her grandfather Alfred, tells me she never heard of Walter, who is her grandfather's cousin. I'm surprised at that. For many years, the cousins lived in the same city, but apparently without any social intercourse. I have not pursued the stories of these brothers and sisters beyond what I have shared here. So back to the questions I asked. Was the George Horner I always saw in the phone directories as a young man a relative? I think so. He was the son of John Jr., eldest son of John Forrest and Mary Wainwright. Why was he never recognized as a distant cousin? I have absolutely no explanation. And how about the mudjacking Horners of later years? Related? Seems like not. George never had a son, and no other offspring I have seen fit the profile. Don't know what a mudjacker is? Well, I spent a lot of time explaining file cutting. I'll let you learn about mudjacking yourself.